Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Friday the 13th. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, Christian, haven't you reviewed this already? And that's right, I did, but as a wise man named Andre Lenoge once said, hell is repetition. I actually first reviewed this movie along with all the sequels all the way back in 2011 for season 1 of Horror Month. That review is still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it on the Horror Month season 1 playlist, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Now, Friday the 13th was produced and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, who prior to this worked with Wes Craven on The Last House on the Left. He was the producer of that movie, and right before this, he did a few family comedies, like he did a film called Here Come the Tigers, which was sort of a Bad News Bears knockoff, and he did a movie called Manny's Orphans, and actually, I think some of the same cast and crew from both those movies would also go on to work with him on this movie. And Cunningham would go on to direct movies like A Stranger Is Watching, Spring Break, The New Kids, and Deep Star 6. And the film was written by Victor Miller, who prior to this worked with Cunningham on Here Come the Tigers and Manny's Orphans. Now, when Victor Miller started working on the script, it was originally going to be called A Long Night at Camp Blood, but then Cunningham came up with the title Friday the 13th and put out an ad in Variety, actually before Miller even finished the script. And the film was primarily shot in, I think, Hardwick, New Jersey in September of 1979, and it was an independent production, but was later picked up for distribution by Paramount. Now, both Sean S. Cunningham and Victor Miller have fully admitted that Friday the 13th is basically a ripoff of John Carpenter's Halloween. Like, Cunningham's made no bones about the fact that he basically wanted to out-Halloween Halloween and deliver a gorier and more exploitive version of the Carpenter film. And in some ways, he was more successful than I think even he could have predicted, because Friday the 13th would go on to become, in so many ways, just as influential and just as important to the horror genre as Halloween. Now, both this and Halloween are also the films that really did sort of kickstart the slasher genre as we would know it now. Now, Halloween was not the first slasher film. Prior to Halloween, you had Black Christmas, and the same year as Black Christmas, you had the original The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I think could qualify as a slasher film, and you also had some of Herschel Gordon Lewis's movies, and even some of the Italian giallo films, which I think could qualify as slasher films. Hell, there are some people who consider Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to be a slasher film, and I think you definitely see some of the roots of the genre in that movie, but even prior to Psycho, you had something like Roger Corman's A Bucket of Blood, which I think could kind of qualify as a slasher film, and honestly, going all the way back to the 1930s, you see some of the roots of the slasher genre in something like the Agatha Christie novel, And Then There Were None, better known as 10 Little Indians. So, it's hard to pinpoint what the true origins of the slasher genre really are, but arguably Friday the 13th and Halloween are the films that sort of established the tropes that we would typically associate with slasher films. So, Friday the 13th, I think, is a classic flick. I do think John Carpenter's Halloween is technically a superior film, but I'll be honest, I've probably rewatched the original Friday the 13th way more than the original Halloween. And by no means is this a perfect movie, but I do really love this film, and in some ways it really is the quintessential slasher film. So the plot of Friday the 13th is it's set at this summer camp called Camp Crystal Lake, and the movie begins in 1958 where we follow these two camp counselors about to have sex, but then we see them get killed by an unseen assailant. The movie then jumps ahead to 21 or 22 years later, and we learn that the camp has been shut down ever since then, and we also learn that a year prior to the murders, a young boy drowned at the lake, which has led many of the locals to believe that the camp has a death curse. And the place has earned the nickname Camp Blood, but it's been over 20 years since the murders, and the camp's owner, a man named Steve Christie, decides to open the place up again, and he hires a group of teenagers or young adults as camp counselors, and they come to help set the place up. So, the majority of the film is set over the course of one day, which happens to be Friday the 13th, and we see these camp counselors get picked off one by an unseen killer. Now, throughout a lot of the movie, it sort of behaves as a whodunit, where we don't really know who the killer is until the very end. Like, there's a character in the movie nicknamed Crazy Ralph who claims to be a messenger of God and believes that God wants him to warn people of this death curse, and the movie sort of teases him as the antagonist. But, spoiler for a 43-year-old film, but ultimately at the end of the movie we learn that these murders were being committed by a woman named Pamela Voorhees, or technically her name is just Mrs. Voorhees. We don't find out till the sequels that her name was Pamela, but this woman, Mrs. Voorhees, her son Jason was the boy who drowned in the lake in 1957, and it turns out that after he drowned, she went completely insane, and now she tries to kill anybody who returns to the camp. So, the film stars Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees, definitely one of the great horror movie villains, and she is over the top, but I don't mean that in a bad way. She's over the top in a way that's still kind of believable. And while Pamela Voorhees is a scary character, you do empathize with her a little bit, because ultimately when you break it down, she's a woman who lost her child due to the sheer negligence of the camp counselor. So, you almost don't blame her for going off the deep end. The issue is, though, the camp counselors she's currently going after would have nothing to do with Jason's death, because this is over 20 years after the fact. So, the camp counselors she's going after now, who are like either in their late teens or early 20s during the events of the movie, they would have either been little kids or wouldn't have even been alive when Jason died. But that doesn't matter to Pamela, because in her damaged mind, she thinks that any young person who comes to the camp is just going to engage in the same sort of behavior that, in her eyes, got Jason killed, so she thinks she's preventing more Jasons by killing these kids. It's also hinted that ever since Jason died, she's developed split personality disorder, or what they now call dissociative personality disorder, because there are certain points where she sort of takes on the persona of Jason, where she starts talking in this little kid voice and starts saying, "Kill her, mommy, kill her," which of course is a total inverse of Norman Bates from Psycho. Now, Betsy Palmer does a great job in this movie, especially for somebody who didn't even want to be there, because Betsy Palmer has made no bones about the fact that when she first read the script, she thought it was a piece of shit, and the only reason she took the job was because her car broke down and she needed money to get a new car. But that being said, she does not give a half-assed performance in this movie at all, and over the years, I think she did develop at least a respect for the movie, or at least the movie's legacy, and I never met her myself, but I did see her from a distance at a convention once. This was a few years before she died, obviously, and by all accounts, she was lovely to her fans, while I don't think she ever actually liked the movie itself. Now, probably the movie's biggest failing, and Betsy Palmer has even pointed this out, is it's supposed to be this big twist when you find out that it was her committing these murders. The issue is, when we see her at the end, that's the first time in the movie we're seeing her, so she's a character who kinda comes out of nowhere. Like, really, the movie should have introduced her earlier. Like, yes, we do get references to a boy drowning in 1957 in the beginning of the film, but we don't actually know anything about Pamela herself until the very end, and she really should have been introduced, like, maybe in the middle of the film. That way it's more of a shock, like, holy shit, she's the killer. similar. Now, with the exception of Mrs. Voorhees, the characters in Friday the 13th are certainly not the deepest or most complex characters in the world, and Cunningham's admitted that he was not setting out to make some grand artistic statement with this film. He set out to make more of a popcorn flick, or a potboiler as he called it. That being said, the characters are still likable, at least in my opinion, and they're kind of silly, but at the same time they're done in a way where they are realistic for the most part. Like, I could still buy these as real teenagers or young adults. And a lot of the film has the feel of a summer hangout movie that just happens to throw a killer into the mix. And in the film, you just have a bunch of innocent kids who didn't really do anything wrong, just getting caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the film, Adrienne King plays Alice, who is ostensibly the protagonist or the final girl of the film. And Alice is a likable character. Again, you don't really get a lot of deep characterization with her, but you do get hints of certain things. Like, there's the subtle hint that things might not be great with her home life, and it's also hinted that she might not really be sure which direction she wants to go in with her life. It's also heavily implied in one scene that there might be something going on between her and her boss, Steve Christie, who is a man who's significantly older than her, but the movie does hint at possibly a sexual affair between the two. Because there's a scene where her and Steve Christie are talking, and Steve is talking to her in a very intimate way, and at the end of the scene, he does caress her cheek, but at the same time, she does look kind of uncomfortable when he caresses her cheek, so it's possible that Steve Christie might just be a fucking creep, but it's also somewhat implied that there might actually be something going on between the two. You also have the character of Bill, who growing up I always assumed was supposed to be Alice's boyfriend, but watching the movie now, there actually is nothing in the film that would necessarily indicate that. But Bill was played by Harry Crosby, who is actually the son of Bing Crosby, and is the half-uncle of actress Denise Crosby. This was, I think, the only theatrical movie Harry Crosby ever did. He did a lot of television work, but would ultimately go on to be a businessman. Now, probably the most famous member of the cast, although he wasn't really that famous at the time, is Kevin Bacon. This was right after he did Animal House, but he was still a relatively unknown actor at the time. And Kevin Bacon plays the character of Jack, who, again, like a lot of the characters in the film, is relatively two-dimensional, but is still a likable character for the most part. Like, he is a bit of a jock, but he doesn't come off as a jerk or anything like that, and you feel bad when he inevitably gets killed. The same goes for Jack's girlfriend Marcy, played by Jeannine Taylor. Then you have Brenda, played by Laurie Bartram, and unfortunately this actress is no longer with us. She died in 2007 of pancreatic cancer, and I lost a loved one to that disease several years ago, so I can tell you that is not an easy death, so that is really sad and tragic to find out. Then you have the character of Ned, played by Mark Nelson, and I do like this character. He's the comic relief, but if you look at the character from a 2023 perspective, there are certain things he does in this movie that does kind of cross the line, and I'm not just talking about the scene where he's dressed up as a stereotypical Native American. Like, I'll admit, as offensive as that scene is, I do kind of laugh at that. I mean, I do have a bit of a politically incorrect sense of humor. Sorry. But one scene in the movie that I want to bring up is, there's a point in the film where he pretends to drown, and he uses this as an excuse for Brenda to give him mouth-to-mouth, just so he can kiss her, and it's like, yeah, somebody did that today, they would rightfully so get their ass kicked, and then probably have a sexual harassment charge leveled against them. Then you have the character of Steve Christie, played by Peter Brouwer, and I I want to like this character, but again, if you assume there is something going on between him and Alice, that does make the character a little problematic. Granted, they never actually say how old Alice is, and I've always assumed that she is at least over 18, but the character of Steve Christie definitely appears to be in his 30s at least. Granted, if Alice is in her 20s, then I guess it's okay, but at the same time, he is so significantly older than her. But that is if we assume there really is something going on between them, because ultimately that's all fan speculation, because while it's hinted at in the movie, it's never said flat out. And then you have Walt Gorney, who kind of steals the movie as Crazy Ralph. And like I said, the movie kind of teases the possibility that maybe Ralph is the killer, at least until the reveal with Pamela Voorhees happens at the end. But Crazy Ralph is a great and very iconic character. And he is definitely the harbinger of doom character that you see in so many other horror films, so you could accuse the character of being kind of cliched, but keep in mind, when the movie came out, I don't think he was as cliched, because this is one of the movies that really did establish the tropes that we would typically associate with slasher films. Now, in the movie, you do see Jason in a flashback sequence, and then you see the ghost of Jason in a dream sequence at the very end of the film. Now, in the film, Jason is played by then-child actor Ari Lehman, who worked with Cunningham before on Manny's Orphans, and I actually met Ari Lehman a few years ago. He does a lot of convention stuff now, and he's proud of his role in this movie, and he's in a metal band now called First Jason. I also got his autograph here as well, which you might have noticed was sitting in the background there. Now, in the film, the makeup and special effects were done by Tom Savini, coming right off the heels of Dawn of the Dead, and for the most part, the makeup effects in this movie is really well done. Like Jason, who is supposed to be a deformed child, the makeup effects for him in the dream sequence and the flashback is really well done and looks very realistic. But I will say, I have the movie on Blu-ray now. I used to have the old DVD, but I ended up getting the Blu-ray, and the film is almost hurt by being in Ultra HD. Like, the scene where Jack gets the arrow through his neck, you can kind of tell that's a prosthetic. I will say, though, that Marcy's death scene where she gets the axe to her face, that scene holds up really well and is actually still pretty shocking. Now, for the most part, Friday the 13th tries to be a reality-based horror film, but there is sort of the subtle undercurrent of the supernatural, which of course the sequels would go completely insane with later on. Like, there is sort of the implication that maybe the camp really does have a death curse, like, maybe Crazy Ralph is not as crazy as people think, and perhaps Jason was just a victim of the camp itself, and maybe to a certain extent Pamela was just an avatar for the camp. And even though the scene where Jason comes out of the lake and pulls Alice out of the canoe, even though that was supposed to be a dream sequence, there's sort of the implication that maybe it really was the ghost of Jason, especially because the final shot of the movie, you see these ripples on the lake, sort of indicating that something is down there. Although when I met Ari Lehman, he told me that the final shot of the movie literally meant nothing. It's just sort of something that fans have sort of read into. Now, I want to point out that that dream sequence was actually not in the original script. It was actually Tom Savini's idea. He had recently seen Brian De Palma's Carrie, which of course is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. Now, at the end of Carrie, there's a scene where Sue Snell has a nightmare where Carrie's hand comes up out of the ground and grabs her wrist, and Tom Savini thought it would be really cool to have a similar scene in this movie. Now, there is subtext subtext in the film, but I think a lot of the subtext was more accidental and wasn't really Sean S. Cunningham or Victor Miller's intention. But if you look at Pamela Voorhees in the film, she definitely seems to have a problem with young people having sex or drinking or doing drugs, and actually this is one of the movies that established that trope that, oh, if you get laid, you die, which I have issues with that trope, but technically that trope does apply to this movie, and you could almost look at Pamela Voorhees as being sort of a satire on a conservative, and this movie came out only a few months before Ronald Reagan became president, and this was sort of the rise of neoconservatism in America and that whole moral majority horseshit. And some critics have seen the film as almost reflecting all that. Again, I think that's people kind of reaching way deeper than was actually intended. And keep in mind, I'm all for finding subtext in movies that maybe wasn't originally intended, but at the same time, one of my issues with how people read this film is I feel like people have read into this film as having almost a puritanical agenda. Like somehow we're supposed to be rooting for Pamela when she's killing these kids for engaging in this quote-unquote sinful behavior. Like somehow these kids deserve it. Again, I don't think the movie's actually saying that, but I feel like some people have taken the wrong message from the film. And one of the things I think kind of leads into the whole reading of not just Friday the 13th, but slasher films in general having some sort of puritanical agenda is this idea that the final girl is always the virgin, is always the one who doesn't drink and doesn't smoke and believes in God. Meanwhile, I don't see any of that with Alice. You see Alice drinking and smoking in this movie, and again, there is that implication that she's sleeping with Steve Christie, so even though this is one of the movies that sort of established that trope isn't even in this movie. Now lastly, I do gotta mention Harry Manfredini's score for the film, which is masterful. This movie would not be the same without its music. And everybody remembers the ma 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 part of the score, but there's so much more to the score than just that. There's this intense violin music that plays through a lot of the movie that's very reminiscent of Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho. And when you see Alice on the canoe at the end of the film, there's this beautiful music that plays over the scene before Jason comes out of the lake, and that same music is played for the end credits. Again, it's a very well done score. So yeah, Friday the 13th is definitely one of my favorite horror films, and again, it's not a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination. Watching the movie now, admittedly there are parts that don't hold up the best, but it's still a very important movie to me. I first saw this film when I was 11 years old, so the film has a lot of sentimental value for me, and again, I do think it's a very good example of this kind of horror film. Now, earlier this year, I actually got to see this movie in the theaters. It was playing at a theater here on Long Island called the Cinema Arts Center, and I've actually seen quite a few of the Friday the 13th movies there. It was actually on Friday the 13th in January of this year, and this is gonna sound weird, but it was a double feature of that and Skidamarink. Talk about two opposite ends of the horror spectrum. Now, while Friday the 13th was a massive hit when it came out, the film did not fare well with critics at all, especially with Siskel and Ebert. Siskel and Ebert hated this movie with a passion. I think Gene Siskel even called Sean Cunningham a despicable human being, and I think they even tried to sort of publicly shame Betsy Palmer for being in the film, and look, I respect Siskel and Ebert, but I think they took their hatred of this movie a little too far. The film was even featured on a special that Siskel and Ebert did in either late 1980 or early 1981, where they tried to imply that Friday the 13th and other films of its ilk were misogynistic. Meanwhile, in this movie, the main character, the one who ends up standing up to the killer and killing the killer at the end, is a woman. Now, like I said, despite not faring well with critics, the film was a massive hit at the box office, and it was really Friday the 13th that kicked off the early 80s slasher boom, because there was this period from like 81 to either 83 or 84 where we were basically getting a new slasher film almost every month. Some of these movies were probably more so inspired by Halloween, like Prom Night, which I know came out after Friday the 13th, but I think it was shot sometime beforehand. You had films like My Bloody Valentine and Slumber Party Massacre, and then later on you had Silent Night, Deadly Night, and again, while those films might be more so based on Halloween, I think they also owe something to Friday the 13th. In fact, I think it was because of Friday the 13th that they ended up doing Halloween 2, and you could tell that Halloween 2 was definitely inspired by Friday the 13th because that is a lot gorier and more exploitive than the first movie. So ironically, even though Friday the 13th was a Halloween ripoff, it's kinda because of Friday the 13th that Halloween even became a franchise. And then you had a lot of summer camp slasher films, or slasher films that just happened to be set in the woods, which were clearly inspired by Friday the 13th. Movies like The Burning, Madman, Sleepaway Camp, Memorial Valley Massacre. Now, when Sean S. Cunningham made Friday the 13th, he intended it to be a standalone film, but of course this movie spawned a huge multimedia franchise, which included a long-running series of sequels. Now, in the sequels, they made Jason, the boy who was said to have drowned before the events of the first movie, the antagonist, which was something that pretty much everybody behind the first movie was against. And they never actually did explain how Jason came back. Now, in the earlier Friday the 13th sequels, they tried to suggest that maybe Jason never actually did die in 1957, but somehow lived after supposedly drowning and was just living out in the woods this whole time, which kinda negates the whole point of the first movie. But later on in the series, they sort of retcon that by suggesting that, oh no, Jason actually did drown in 1957, but he came back by supernatural means, like maybe his spirit is unable to rest for as long as people are returning to the lake. But in the earlier Friday the 13th sequels, Jason is clearly human. He's just a deformed, mentally challenged man, but as the sequels go on, they sort of imply that he might have some superhuman strength and possibly even a healing factor. And ultimately, after getting killed a few times, the series drops all pretenses at realism, and Jason comes back as an outright zombie for the later Friday the 13th sequels. And by the time we got to the 9th Friday the 13th movie, Jason Goes to Hell, it was revealed that Jason was actually a kind of a demon, which is not a plot point that a lot of fans were fond of. I happen to really like Jason Goes to Hell myself. And the tone of these movies got progressively more ridiculous and over the top until we got to the 10th Friday the 13th movie, Jason X, which was set hundreds of years in the future and was set in outer space, and we ultimately see Jason in that movie get turned into a kind of a cyborg. Now, the final Friday the 13th sequel was 2003's Freddy vs. Jason, which continuity-wise was set between the events of Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X, and was also a crossover with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, officially setting the two franchises in the same universe. The franchise was rebooted in 2009, and the 2009 reboot attempted to return the series to the quasi-realism of the first few movies. Now, outside of the movies, there was actually a Friday the 13th TV series in the late 80s, which, despite having some of the same producers as the movies, was really only part of the franchise in name only. The show actually had nothing to do with Jason. It was about this antique shop that is filled with items cursed by the devil, and in the show, the owners of the antique shop have to go out and collect all these cursed items, and I heard that there were actually plans to cross over the show with the movies. Like, apparently there was going to be an episode involving Jason's cursed hockey mask. But the show was ultimately cancelled. This franchise has also had numerous comic book spin-offs and tie-in novels. Now, whether you count any of these as actually being canon is highly debatable. The franchise also spawned several video games. Now, for the longest time, the franchise was sort of in limbo due to a legal battle between Sean S. Cunningham and Victor Miller over the rights to the franchise, and I think the rights have now reverted to Victor Miller, and currently A24 is developing a TV series that will act as a prequel to the first movie, and I think it's going to be called Crystal Lake. Now, before I close out this video, I want to play an audio clip from a retrospective that me and my friends did back in late 2017 or early 2018 on the Friday the 13th franchise. And this is a clip of my late friend Chris Mano giving his thoughts on the original Friday the 13th. And I kind of debated with myself if I should play this audio clip, because I wondered if it's not a little ghoulish given that he's no longer with us, but Chris was, a great friend, and he was such a huge fan of this franchise that I would feel remiss not to play this audio clip. So here is my late friend Chris's review of the original Friday the 13th.
The first one is a really cool sort of gem in the slasher film lexicon, because I think the thing that really makes it unique is it's a whodunit where the person who did it is introduced until like 10 minutes before you find out it's them. You have like all this crazy carnage going on, and then all of a sudden this friendly old lady shows up, and you're like, how is she going to factor into this? And then you realize she's the killer, and it really kind of throws you for a loop. And it makes for almost like a different movie on the second watch. So that's what I think is unique for it. And it's cool that it stays that unique, even though it's the one that doesn't have Jason as the killer. Like, it's interesting how they both work together in that way.
Next, I want to play an audio clip of a guy who's actually a fan of my channel who contacted me through Facebook, and when I told him I was redoing my reviews of the Friday the 13th movies, he wanted to take part in them, so here are Joey's thoughts on the original Friday the 13th.
Hello, I'm doing a take on the Friday the 13th also, and my take on it is it was a cool movie. In my opinion, it was one of the best in the series, because like the first ones usually are, but in this case, this is what made the Friday the 13th movies, and they made a lot of good sequels in this case. It's like a popcorn flick, but it's really, really cool movie, and it's one that I can keep watching. The same thing with the others, but mainly this one I can watch a lot. It's not one that I ever get bored with. It's really, because I grew up with these movies, but it's really cool. It stars Adrienne King, Kevin Bacon, which I met one time. That's me with Kevin Bacon. It was in Red Bank, New Jersey. That was about 4 years ago. Really amazing person, really nice. But yeah, I have that picture I took. And I also met Jeannine Taylor at a Persephone convention one time. She was really nice too. As the guy that played the crazy Ralph. He was an amazing character, and he made the movie really good too. Then it stars Robbi Morgan, and but it was really the start of the Friday the 13th movies, which was cool, and that was good about it. And then it went on to the sequels after, and of course you find out that Jason's mother was the one that was the killer in the first one, and then Jason starts in the sequel. Of course, Crazy Ralph was in the sequel too, but it's really cool movie. Like I say, one of my best in the series. I have other ones in the series, but this is one of my best. What I like about this movie too is it takes place in a camp, because I like hiking at times and stuff, so this is why I like this movie too. That was a real camp that was in Blairstown. I actually went there. Blairstown's like a small town, but it's really, really a nice place, a cool place. I went there a few times, and every time I go there, I love it. It's right, because this is where they made the movie, and then I ate, I went to the Blairstown Diner. I ate in there. That's me at the Blairstown Diner. My mother's the one that took the picture, but that was really a nice place to see. But I strongly recommend this movie too if you're someone that never seen it, or even if you did see it, I would always watch it again. At times, it's really a cool movie.
Next up is my friend John giving his thoughts on the original Friday the 13th.
Hi everyone, this is my short video review on the Friday the 13th movie from 1980 for Christian's channel. In a way, I'm glad to be redoing these again because back in 2017, when I did the podcast retrospective with Christian and Jeremy, looking back, I felt like I did not do much of a good job commenting on these movies and then all there to say about the franchise. After seeing the same format so many times, what else is there to say about a bunch of stupid dumb teens going to Camp Crystal Lake, having sex, smoking pot, skinny dipping, and they get slaughtered by Jason, the end. In the 1980s, the slasher subgenre was big and popular. Horror fans loved seeing the same format over and over again, and not just the Friday the 13th movies, any slasher movie in general in the 80s. Like for example, April Fool's Day, Silent Night, Deadly Night, Final Exam, My Bloody Valentine, Prom Night, Terror Train, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. I'll admit, when I was a teenager, after getting into horror movies, I used to like watching the Friday the 13th movies, but as I've gotten older, they don't hold up for me like they used to. At the same time, there's still some like little nostalgia for me to a certain degree, but the first Friday the 13th movie does not hold up for me the same way for like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm not saying that I hate this movie or the series, but yes, I'll admit I own the entire series on Blu-ray. I got this as a birthday present for myself recently. I will say, rewatching the series, I watched the behind-the-scenes deleted scenes that were considered to be too gross, and were cut from the movie because of the MPA restrictions. It was cool watching like the bonus features on the Blu-rays, watching interviews of the actors, writers, producers, and directors. I highly recommend this Blu-ray set of the Friday the 13th franchise. Next year I plan on reviewing the Friday the 13th movies on my YouTube channel. After the success of the first Halloween movie, this movie, while may not be the first Halloween knockoff or rip-off, it was one of the first early rip-offs of trying to be on the same level as Halloween, but it tried a little bit too hard to a certain degree. As a kid before I saw this movie and the rest of the series, was very familiar with who Jason Voorhees was. He's another one of those horror icons. If you never saw the movie or the series, you know who Jason Voorhees, especially that hockey mask has become so iconic for his look. When people think of hockey mask, they think of the sport hockey, but for me when I see hockey mask, my first thought is Jason Voorhees, but that's just me. My first viewing of this movie was October 2009. After marathoning all the Halloween movies, my next phase was watching all the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street movies to watch Freddy vs. Jason. Well, as I said before, I don't hate this movie. Like I said, it basically takes the same idea as Halloween, but this is Halloween done in the summertime. Halloween took place in the fall, Friday the 13th took place in the summer, at a camp in the middle of nowhere. That's a good concept, actually, when you think about it. Even the writers and director admitted they were going for a Halloween knockoff. After Halloween's success, everyone wanted to rip it off and make their own mock version of Halloween around this time. The opening resembles Halloween. Two counselors were having sex and then they were killed by an unknown killer that we don't see. It becomes like a whodunit type of film. Then it jumps to a few years later. Camp Crystal Lake is being reopened, but the people that die are warned that young teen hitchhiker girl not to go there. And the difference is there's no Dr. Loomis type of character in this movie like in Halloween. The character Alice is an okay character, not one of my favorite final girls. When I was rewatching this movie, I never realized how there was like a hint of Steve and Alice were secretly romantically involved, especially the way he touched her. The other characters are like cliche stereotypes, and we know he's gonna live and die. This movie's slow at times. When we see a full demonstration of Alice making coffee, that part could have been cut out. It would not affect the movie at all. But this movie taught me how to make coffee. Thank you. A very young and unknown Kevin Bacon was in this movie. Another actor who starred in a horror movie later became a famous actor after that. Tom Savini did the special effects. Always good to see him do his magic. I like the Kevin Bacon's death scene in this movie. When I first saw this movie, I did not see the big twist coming, thinking because of the franchise main character's reputation, I thought Jason Voorhees was the killer. Did not expect to see that his mother, Pamela Voorhees, was the killer, and that later on in the series, Jason Voorhees would become the main killer throughout the entire series. The finale fight scene between Alice and Pamela is good. It's intense. You root for Alice to kick the shit out of Mrs. Voorhees to get out. Not only did Friday the 13th rip off Halloween, they also ripped off Psycho in reverse. It's like if Norman Bates' mother was the killer instead of Norman Bates. Just like Psycho, Mrs. Voorhees seems to have a split personality disorder. When she speaks to herself, hearing her son's Jason's voice saying, "Kill her, Mommy! Kill her!" Betsy Palmer's the one good part in this movie, as the highlight is Pamela Voorhees. The music score also resembled Bernard Herrmann's score to Psycho when you think about it. Just listen to both soundtracks back to back and compare the soundtracks. Jason may not be the killer in this movie, but it does make a brief cameo at the end, setting up for the rest of the series. As I said before, I don't hate this movie or the series. It just doesn't hold up for me like it used to when I was a teenager. I haven't really seen myself going back to rewatch this series, unless I'm in a specific mood. I hope you like my comments, and hopefully this was a semi-improvement from 2017.
And finally, here's my friend Jeremy giving his thoughts on the first Friday film.
I like the original Friday the 13th film, although it's not my favorite in the series. I have a lot of respect for it since it helped start the popularity of slasher films in the 80s. It's got a great performance from Betsy Palmer, whom I've had the pleasure of meeting. She makes that movie and is easily the most entertaining person to watch in it. She brings such a sadistic glee to Mrs. Voorhees, and it's just so much fun to watch. The kills in this movie are also really well done. My favorite is the one in which Kevin Bacon gets the arrow through his neck. The movie does have flaws, like the long filler scenes that are really boring. The fact that Mrs. Voorhees' reveal as the killer comes out of nowhere. I remember reading an interview with Betsy Palmer in which she said to Sean S. Cunningham that he should at least give the audience a hint that she's on the scene, and that he just said, let him guess. Still, this is an enjoyable slasher film for the most part, and definitely earns its place in the history of horror. I've met several of the cast. As I mentioned before, I met Betsy Palmer. I've met Adrienne King, Kevin Bacon, and Sean S. Cunningham. Anyway, I'll wrap up here. If you're into horror and haven't seen this movie yet, give it a watch.
So, I hope you enjoyed this video. That was my review of Friday the 13th, and my next movie review will be on Friday the 13th Part 2.